This is not a battle casualty, Admiral. This is the proof.
Good God, Lieutenant. What have they done?
She raised her shirt to reveal the wound, and the Admiral fell silent. When he saw her rib scars, the Navy Cross gleamed against Lieutenant Eva Callahan's dress blues as Admiral Marcus Lee approached the podium, but the medal felt heavier than the shrapnel still lodged beneath her ribs. The ceremony at Naval Operations Command was all polished brass and patriotic speeches, yet Eva's eyes remained fixed on the empty chairs where her fallen teammates should have been sitting. When the Admiral spoke of extraordinary heroism and classified operations in the South Pacific, the words tasted like blood and betrayal. What the distinguished guests didn't know, what the sanitized after-action reports had carefully omitted, was that Operation Neptune's Trident hadn't been a heroic rescue mission. It had been a setup orchestrated by officials who'd sacrificed 6 Navy SEALs to protect their own political careers. Eva had survived to receive honors that should have been funeral flowers carrying scars that told a different story than the one being celebrated today. The truth was carved into her flesh, and Admiral Lee was about to see every mark. The Naval Operations Command building loomed over Washington, D.C., like a monument to American sea power, its corridors lined with portraits of heroes whose sacrifices had been honored rather than hidden. In the Admiral's suite, where Eva now stood facing her commanding officer, the weight of institutional authority pressed down like deep ocean pressure familiar to a SEAL who'd learned to operate in crushing environments where survival depended on adapting to impossible conditions. Lieutenant Eva Callahan embodied everything the Navy wanted in its Special Operations Forces: brilliant tactical mind, unbreakable physical conditioning, and absolute loyalty to mission and teammates. At 28, she'd completed 3 deployments with SEAL Team 7, earning respect through competence rather than seeking attention through bravado. Her specialty was underwater demolition and coastal reconnaissance skills that had made her invaluable for operations in the contested waters of the South China Sea. The mission that had earned her the Navy Cross and carved permanent scars into her body and soul had been sold as intelligence gathering on illegal weapons trafficking. 6 SEALs infiltrating a remote Pacific island to document Chinese military equipment being transferred to insurgent groups. Clean insertion, minimal contact extraction after 48 hours of surveillance. The kind of operation SEAL teams executed flawlessly dozens of times each year. Admiral Marcus Lee represented the old guard of Navy leadership men who'd built careers during the Cold War when enemies were clearly defined and missions had obvious objectives. At 58, he commanded respect through decades of service and genuine concern for the sailors under his command. But the modern Navy operated in gray areas, where political considerations often trumped military judgment, where classified operations served diplomatic agendas that field operators never fully understood. The ceremony had been carefully orchestrated to project strength and honor while concealing the mission's true nature. Eva's teammates, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, Petty Officer Martinez, Seaman Brooks, Petty Officer Thompson, and Petty Officer Davis were remembered as heroes who died serving their country. The classified nature of their operation meant their families received folded flags and condolences, but never learned how their sons had been betrayed by the system they'd sworn to serve. The South Pacific operation had been compromised before the team ever left the submarine. Intelligence officials had leaked mission details to Chinese forces, intending to create an incident that would justify increased military presence in the region. The SEAL team was supposed to be captured, not killed, providing proof of Chinese aggression that would support defense budget increases and base expansion treaties with allied nations. The plan had failed catastrophically when Chinese forces chose elimination over capture. Eva's survival was accidental. She'd been conducting underwater reconnaissance when the ambush began surfacing to find her teammates dead and enemy forces searching for survivors. Her escape had been a 30-hour ordeal of combat, swimming, evading patrol boats, and finally reaching the extraction point where she'd transmitted the truth about what had happened on that remote island. The cover-up had been immediate and comprehensive. Official reports described a heroic mission that had gathered valuable intelligence before being discovered by superior enemy forces. Eva's teammates were posthumously decorated for valor, while she received recognition for completing the mission despite overwhelming odds. The narrative was inspiring and patriotic, perfect for recruiting videos and congressional hearings on defense appropriations. But the scars beneath Eva's uniform told a different story, one written in shrapnel from grenades that should never have been waiting for them, carved by coral reefs she'd scraped against during her desperate escape, marked by infection from wounds left untreated during 30 hours of survival swimming. Each mark was evidence of betrayal, proof that her teammates had died not for freedom or democracy, but for political theater orchestrated by officials who'd never faced enemy fire. The time had come to show Admiral Lee what Operation Neptune's Trident had really cost. The conversation began with Admiral Lee's genuine concern for Eva's welfare, his paternal instincts recognizing trauma that medals couldn't heal. "Lieutenant Callahan, you've been through an ordeal that would break most people. How are you holding up?" His question was personal rather than professional, offered with the understanding that command meant caring for subordinates' mental health as well as their operational effectiveness. Eva's response was measured and controlled, revealing nothing of the storm building beneath her composed exterior. "Admiral, I'm grateful for the recognition, but I need to discuss the mission itself. There are aspects of Operation Neptune's Trident that require your attention." Her words were chosen carefully, testing whether Lee was complicit in the cover-up or merely uninformed about its true nature. The Admiral's reaction suggested genuine interest rather than defensive deflection. "Of course, Lieutenant. Your after-action report was remarkable. Completing the intelligence gathering despite losing your entire team shows extraordinary dedication. What additional information can you provide?" His willingness to listen created an opening that Eva had been hoping for since returning from the Pacific. The moment of truth arrived when Eva decided that words alone wouldn't convey the reality of what had happened to her and her teammates. "Admiral, with your permission, I'd like to show you something that wasn't included in the official reports." Her hand moved toward the buttons of her dress blue jacket, preparing to reveal evidence that would shatter the carefully constructed narrative surrounding their mission. Lee's nod of consent was professional, but curious. He'd seen combat wounds before, understood that military operations left marks that extended beyond psychological trauma. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what Eva was about to reveal, physical proof of betrayal that had been hidden beneath dress uniforms and official silence. The jacket came off first, revealing the crisp white shirt beneath. Then, with deliberate precision that spoke of military training and personal resolve, Eva began unbuttoning the shirt to expose the sports bra and scarred skin underneath. Each button was a decision to trust this man with truth that could destroy careers, end her own military service, and challenge the institutional narrative that protected political interests over military lives. The scars were immediately visible, and obviously recent angry red marks across her ribs where shrapnel had torn through tactical gear that should have protected her from improvised explosive devices. But these weren't random wounds from battlefield chaos. They formed patterns that told a specific story about specific weapons used in a specific ambush that had been orchestrated rather than accidental. "Admiral," Eva said quietly, her voice steady. Despite the emotional weight of revelation, these are shrapnel wounds from Chinese Type 67 fragmentation grenades, the same grenades that killed my teammates in an ambush that was waiting for us before we ever reached the island. Her clinical description was delivered with the precision of someone who'd analyzed every aspect of the operation that had cost 5 lives and nearly claimed her own. The deeper significance was revealed as Eva pointed to specific scars, each one corresponding to moments during the firefight that had been orchestrated by officials who'd sacrificed American lives for political advantage. This one is from the first explosion, which came from a position that had been prepared specifically for our insertion point. This one is from the secondary device that was detonated when we tried to reach our emergency rally point. Admiral Lee's silence was profound and telling. As Eva continued her anatomical catalog of betrayal, his face reflected the growing horror of someone realizing that his own institution had murdered the sailors he'd sworn to protect. The scars were evidence that couldn't be explained away by official reports or classified briefings. They were proof written in flesh and blood that Operation Neptune's Trident had been an execution disguised as a mission. The revelation was complete when Eva showed the deepest scar running along her lower ribs where coral had torn her flesh during the 30-hour escape that had kept her alive to tell this story. Admiral's 6 good sailors died because someone decided their lives were worth less than a political narrative. I survived to bring back the truth, not to be decorated for participating in their murder. Admiral Lee's response to Eva's revelation was immediate and visceral, a man confronting evidence that his own institution had betrayed everything he'd spent his career defending. "Lieutenant, are you alleging that Operation Neptune's Trident was deliberately compromised, that your teammates were knowingly sent into an ambush?" His voice carried the weight of someone whose worldview was collapsing in real time, whose faith in naval command was being shattered by undeniable evidence. Eva's confirmation was delivered with military precision and devastating detail. "Admiral, the intelligence we received was fabricated. The insertion coordinates were leaked to Chinese forces. The timing of our operation coincided with joint exercises that positioned enemy assets for optimal response. Every aspect of the mission was designed to create an incident that would justify increased military presence in the South China Sea. The institutional implications were staggering as Lee processed the scope of the betrayal. His questions came rapidly, seeking details that would either confirm or refute Eva's accusations. Who had access to your mission parameters? Which offices provided intelligence support? What was the chain of authorization for the operation? Each inquiry revealed his growing understanding that the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of naval command. Eva's evidence was comprehensive and damning. From her jacket pocket, she produced a waterproof case containing documents she'd salvaged during her escaped Chinese communications intercepts that revealed advanced knowledge of American SEAL team insertion tactical dispositions that had been prepared specifically for their arrival, and ammunition markings that proved the weapons used against them had been supplied by officials seeking to create a controllable incident. The investigation that followed Admiral Lee's initial shock was methodical and thorough. Using his administrative access, he began cross-referencing Eva's allegations with classified operational records, communications logs, and intelligence reports that had been restricted to his clearance level. Each document confirmed another aspect of Eva's accusations, while revealing the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy that had killed her teammates. The political dimensions became clear as Lee's investigation revealed connections between the operations planners and defense contractors, seeking increased military spending in the Pacific region. Operation Neptune's Trident hadn't been intelligence gathering, it had been theater designed to create justification for billion-dollar military contracts and strategic base expansions that would benefit specific corporations and political careers. The psychological impact on both officers was profound and different. Eva experienced validation after months of being told her suspicions were trauma-induced paranoia, while Lee faced the destruction of everything he'd believed about naval honor and institutional integrity. Their shared recognition of systemic corruption created a bond that transcended rank and protocol, uniting them in a mission that would define both their careers. The escalation intensified when Lee's investigation triggered security alerts that revealed they were being monitored by the same officials who'd orchestrated the original cover-up. His access to classified files was being tracked, his communications were under surveillance, and his meetings with Eva were being reported to supervisors who'd participated in the conspiracy. The danger became personal when both officers received indirect threats disguised as career counseling. Lee was advised that his excessive interest in operational details might affect his promotion prospects, while Eva was warned that her persistent focus on classified operations could result in psychological evaluation and potential medical discharge. The institutional pressure reached critical levels when Admiral Patricia Morrison, Lee's superior, directly ordered him to terminate his investigation and recommend Eva for psychiatric evaluation. Marcus Lieutenant Callahan has been through severe trauma. Her allegations are clearly the result of survivor's guilt and PTSD. She needs medical help, not encouragement of her conspiracy theories. The cover-up was expanding to include new victims as officials sought to contain the truth through intimidation and character assassination. Eva's service record was being scrutinized for any evidence of mental instability, while Lee's decades of exemplary service were being questioned by superiors who'd once considered him a potential chief of naval operations. The breakthrough came when Eva revealed the existence of additional evidence recordings she'd made during her escape that captured Chinese forces discussing the advance warning they'd received about American SEAL team insertion. The audio was clear and undeniable, proving that the ambush had been coordinated rather than accidental. The recordings were devastating because they named specific American officials who'd provided operational intelligence to Chinese forces. The conspiracy involved not just Naval Command, but State Department officials, defense contractors, and congressional representatives who'd profited from the increased military spending that followed the heroic mission that had cost 5 American lives. Lee's decision to support Eva, despite official pressure, was both moral courage and career suicide. His investigation had revealed corruption that reached the highest levels of government, making him a threat to powerful interests that had already demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice military personnel for political advantage. The crisis reached its peak when Eva and Lee were summoned to individual meetings designed to isolate them and break their alliance. The separation was intended to allow superior pressure to force Lee's compliance, while psychiatric evaluation could discredit Eva's allegations before they could reach congressional oversight or media attention. The confrontation was approaching that would test both officers' commitment to truth over career advancement, honor over institutional loyalty, and justice over personal safety. The stakes had escalated beyond personal vindication to encompass fundamental questions about military integrity and democratic accountability. The systematic destruction of Eva's credibility began with a psychiatric evaluation ordered by Admiral Morrison designed to discredit her allegations before they could reach congressional investigators or media outlets. Dr. Janet Crawford, a military psychologist with financial ties to defense contractors, was selected to conduct the evaluation with predetermined conclusions about Eva's mental stability and reliability as a witness. The evaluation was scheduled immediately after Eva's revelation to Admiral Lee, its timing designed to create the impression that her allegations were symptoms of psychological breakdown rather than evidence of institutional corruption. The questions were leading and hostile, focused on her trauma responses rather than the factual basis of her accusations about Operation Neptune's Trident. Lieutenant Callahan's survivor's guilt often manifests as conspiracy theories designed to assign blame for tragedies that were actually due to operational hazards. Dr. Crawford began her tone suggesting compassion while delivering predetermined conclusions. Your allegations about deliberate betrayal are consistent with PTSD-induced paranoia that requires immediate treatment. Eva's response was controlled but defiant, revealing her understanding that the evaluation was part of the cover-up rather than legitimate medical care. Doctor, I'm not suffering from paranoia. I'm reporting factual information about a compromised operation that resulted in the murder of my teammates. The evidence speaks for itself. The psychological pressure intensified when Crawford began questioning Eva's memory of events, suggesting that trauma had distorted her perceptions and created false memories of betrayal where none existed. Lieutenant, severe trauma can alter memory formation, creating vivid but inaccurate recollections that feel completely real to the victim. Your brain may be protecting you from accepting the random nature of combat losses by creating explanations that assign intentional causation. Meanwhile, Admiral Lee faced his own crisis as Morrison summoned him to a private meeting that would test his loyalty to the institution versus his commitment to truth and justice. The conference room was occupied by officials whose presence revealed the conspiracy's scope. Representatives from Naval Intelligence, Defense Department contractors, and congressional staff members who'd benefited from increased military spending following Operation Neptune's Trident. Admiral Lee, Morrison began with false regret. Your investigation into Lieutenant Callahan's allegations has created serious concerns about your judgment and discretion. The operation she's questioning was classified at the highest levels for national security reasons. Your continued pursuit of these matters threatens ongoing diplomatic negotiations in the Pacific region. The institutional threats were both professional and personal. Lee's pension could be affected by findings of poor judgment in handling classified matters, while his family's security clearances could be revoked based on associations with potentially compromised personnel. The message was clear: abandon the investigation or face comprehensive destruction of everything he'd built over 3 decades of service. Eva's darkest moment came when she was placed under administrative restriction, confined to base housing, while undergoing evaluation, effectively isolated from any support network or means of communication with outside authorities. Her phone was confiscated, her computer access was terminated, and her movements were monitored by personnel who'd been told she represented a security risk. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and cruel. Eva was informed that her teammates' families had been told she was undergoing treatment for service-related mental health issues, implying that her behavior was dishonoring their memory. The isolation was designed to break her spirit, while official narratives about her instability were circulated through military channels. Admiral Lee's final test came when he was offered promotion to Chief of Naval Operations in exchange for recommending Eva's medical discharge and ceasing his investigation. The position represented the pinnacle of naval service, everything he'd worked toward throughout his career, offered as the price of his silence about institutional murder. The offer was delivered by Morrison with cynical understanding of human ambition. Marcus, you've served with distinction for 30 years. The Navy needs leaders who understand the complexities of modern operations, who can balance operational security with congressional oversight. Lieutenant Callahan is one officer whose trauma has affected her judgment. Your career shouldn't be sacrificed for her inability to accept the realities of combat. The moral complexity was devastating. Accepting the promotion would position Lee to implement reforms that could prevent future betrayals, but it would require abandoning Eva and validating the system that had murdered her teammates. Refusing would end his career while potentially leaving the corruption intact for other officials to exploit. Eva's breaking point arrived when she was informed that her congressional testimony had been canceled due to medical concerns about her fitness for duty. The Democratic oversight that should have investigated military corruption was being thwarted by psychiatric evaluations that served political rather than medical purposes. The isolation was complete and crushing. Eva's truth was being buried beneath official lies, her teammates' sacrifice was being dishonored by the same institution they died serving, and her own service was being perverted into evidence of mental instability rather than moral courage. The system that had created Operation Neptune's Trident was now completing its mission by destroying the survivor who threatened to expose its crimes. The breakthrough came when Admiral Lee made a decision that would define his legacy and potentially save American democracy from military corruption. Rather than accepting promotion or submitting to institutional pressure, he chose to risk everything by contacting Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Armed Services Committee and a former Navy officer who'd built her political career on military accountability. Lee's approach to Senator Williams was methodical and comprehensive, presenting Eva's evidence alongside his own investigation in a package that was legally unassailable and politically explosive. The documentation included audio recordings of Chinese forces discussing advance warning, about SEAL team insertion financial records showing suspicious payments to defense contractors, and communication logs, revealing coordination between naval officials and corporate interests that had profited from increased Pacific military spending. The senator's response was immediate and decisive. Williams had been investigating defense spending irregularities for months, suspecting corruption, but lacking evidence that could support congressional action. Lee's presentation provided the missing pieces that transformed suspicion into actionable intelligence, while Eva's testimony offered first-hand witness accounts that could survive legal challenges. The rescue of Eva from psychiatric detention required careful coordination between congressional oversight and military law. Senator Williams used her committee authority to demand Eva's appearance before Congress, while Lee provided internal support that ensured her safe transport from military custody to Capitol Hill. The operation resembled a military extraction, with Eva being liberated from institutional persecution by the same democratic processes her teammates had died defending. Eva's congressional testimony was broadcast live on national television, creating a moment of accountability that reached millions of Americans who'd been told that Operation Neptune's Trident represented heroic military service. Her appearance before the Armed Services Committee was both personal vindication and institutional reckoning, proving that individual courage could challenge systemic corruption when supported by democratic oversight. The testimony began with Eva's recounting of the mission that had cost 5 American lives, her clinical precision in describing the ambush, providing evidence that couldn't be dismissed as trauma-induced fantasy. Senators, my teammates, were murdered by officials who sacrificed American lives to create political theater that would justify increased military spending and strategic base expansion. The visual impact was devastating when Eva revealed her scars to the committee and television audience, each mark providing physical evidence of betrayal that official reports had concealed. The wounds told a story that contradicted every aspect of the sanitized narrative, proving that heroic sacrifice had actually been bureaucratic murder disguised as patriotic service. The institutional collapse was swift and comprehensive as Eva's testimony triggered investigations that revealed the conspiracy's full scope. Naval officials resigned and disgraced defense contractors faced federal prosecution, and congressional representatives who'd profited from increased military spending found themselves under investigation for corruption and conspiracy. Admiral Lee's vindication came through his promotion to Chief of Naval Operations, but under circumstances that allowed him to implement comprehensive reforms rather than perpetuate systemic corruption. His leadership would focus on preventing future operations like Neptune's Trident, while ensuring that military service honored democratic values rather than corporate interests. The justice that followed was both legal and institutional. The officials who'd orchestrated Operation Neptune's Trident faced federal charges, including murder conspiracy and violation of their oaths of office. The trials were public and thorough, ensuring that their crimes were documented for history, while their punishments served as deterrents to future corruption. Eva's transformation from silent survivor to vocal advocate was remarkable and inspiring. Her congressional testimony led to speaking engagements at military academies, veteran organizations, and civilian institutions that needed to understand the cost of institutional corruption. Her message was consistent and powerful. Military service required moral courage that extended beyond physical bravery to include willingness to challenge authority when authority betrayed democratic principles. The policy changes that resulted from Eva's testimony were comprehensive and lasting. The Military Accountability Act required congressional oversight of all special operations, while the Operational Transparency Initiative ensured that classified missions could be reviewed by independent inspectors general who reported directly to democratic oversight rather than military hierarchy. The memorial service for Eva's fallen teammates was finally conducted with honesty about their sacrifice and the circumstances of their deaths. Their families learned the truth about how their sons had died, while their service was honored as examples of military virtue betrayed by institutional corruption rather than lost to operational hazards. The personal healing that Eva experienced was gradual but genuine. Her scars remained as evidence of betrayal, but they also became symbols of survival and resistance to corruption. The therapy she received was legitimate medical care rather than institutional control, focused on helping her process trauma while validating her courage in speaking truth to power. Admiral Lee's leadership as Chief of Naval Operations was transformative for the entire service. His reforms emphasized moral courage alongside physical bravery, ensuring that future naval officers understood their obligation to challenge illegal orders and report institutional corruption. The culture change was profound and lasting, creating space for dissent and accountability that had been missing from military hierarchy. The media impact was national and sustained. Eva's story became a symbol of individual courage, challenging institutional corruption, inspiring similar investigations into other military operations and defense spending programs. The accountability that followed her testimony extended beyond the Navy to encompass broader questions about democratic oversight of military activities. The international implications were equally significant. Eva's revelation that American officials had orchestrated fake military incidents to justify increased spending damaged diplomatic relationships while forcing reassessment of military cooperation agreements. The credibility crisis required years of rebuilding trust with allies who'd been deceived about American military operations. The educational impact was profound and lasting. Military academies began teaching courses on moral courage and institutional resistance, using Eva's example to demonstrate that true military honor required willingness to challenge authority when authority violated democratic principles. Her testimony became required viewing for officer candidates, ensuring that future military leaders understood their obligations to truth and justice. 5 years after her testimony, Eva addressed the Naval Academy's graduating class with words that captured her transformation from broken survivor to empowered advocate. "Your oath is to the Constitution, not to the officials who temporarily command you. When those officials betray democratic principles, your duty is to resist their orders and protect the values that make military service meaningful. The standing ovation that followed was both recognition of her courage and commitment by future officers to uphold the standards she'd fought to restore. Admiral Lee, now serving his final year as Chief of Naval Operations, watched from the platform with pride in what institutional accountability could achieve when supported by individual moral courage. The scars that Eva had revealed to Admiral Lee remained visible reminders of institutional betrayal, but they'd been transformed from evidence of victimization into symbols of resistance and survival. Her willingness to show those wounds had saved democracy from military corruption, while proving that truth was more powerful than any institutional authority when supported by courage and evidence. The Eva Callahan reforms transformed American military culture from an institution that protected corruption to one that rewarded moral courage and institutional accountability. Her congressional testimony created legal precedents that required democratic oversight of military operations while protecting whistleblowers from retaliation and institutional persecution. The immediate consequences included the Military Accountability Act, which mandated congressional review of all special operations exceeding specific risk thresholds and cost parameters. The legislation created independent oversight mechanisms that reported directly to democratic institutions rather than military hierarchy, ensuring that operations like Neptune's Trident could never again be orchestrated without civilian knowledge and approval. Educational institutions nationwide incorporated Eva's story into curricula on ethics, leadership, and democratic accountability. Military academies established moral courage as a core competency alongside traditional military skills, while civilian universities used her example to demonstrate how individual resistance could challenge institutional corruption when supported by evidence and democratic processes. The international impact was profound and lasting. Eva's revelation that American officials had orchestrated fake military incidents to justify increased spending, forced reassessment of defense cooperation agreements, and intelligence sharing protocols. Allied nations implemented additional oversight mechanisms to prevent similar deception, while adversaries gained propaganda advantages from documented American military corruption. The legal precedents established through prosecutions of Neptune's Trident conspirators strengthened protections for military whistleblowers and created new categories of federal crimes related to institutional betrayal of military personnel. The Supreme Court ruling in United States v. Morrison established that officials who knowingly endanger military personnel for political gain commit murder under federal law, regardless of their government positions. Admiral Lee's tenure as Chief of Naval Operations was marked by comprehensive cultural reform that emphasized moral courage alongside physical bravery. His leadership development programs required officer candidates to study historical examples of institutional resistance, while promotion criteria included demonstrated willingness to challenge authority when authority violated democratic principles and military honor. The Veterans Affairs system established specialized programs for military personnel who'd experienced institutional betrayal, recognizing that moral injury required different treatment approaches than combat trauma. Eva's advocacy work influenced these programs, ensuring that survivors of institutional corruption received appropriate care, rather than psychiatric evaluation designed to discredit their testimonies. Corporate accountability expanded beyond defense contractors to encompass any entity that profited from corrupted military operations. The financial penalties and criminal prosecutions created market incentives for ethical behavior, while demonstrating that corporate profits couldn't justify military corruption or institutional betrayal of democratic principles. Eva's foundation, established with proceeds from her autobiography and speaking engagements, provides legal support for military whistleblowers and institutional reform advocates. The organization has assisted over 200 cases of military corruption while supporting congressional oversight that prevents systemic abuse of military personnel and resources. The universal message of Eva's story resonated across all democratic institutions. Individual moral courage can challenge institutional corruption when supported by evidence and democratic oversight. Truth is more powerful than authority. When citizens choose accountability over comfort, and military service achieves its highest expression when it protects democratic values rather than institutional convenience.